Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, even good tomorrow. We're live on 5 continents for this little webinar over the next 60 minutes. And we have full attendance, about 100 of us, to talk about one fairly big question. What's happening? What kind of Christian community are we forming in the way in which we worship during the pandemic? There is some research that's been done, but not a great deal. And to help us reflect and begin to explore this topic, I want to introduce the people who are on the panel. First, my colleague at Church Innovations, Dr. Mark Love. Mark is a scholar in the field of congregational development and theology, done some really interesting work on the relationship between models of reconciliation, salvation, and how congregations form themselves. And of course, I have no idea how you see all these people, but another colleague now from Geneva, Dr. Dirk Lange, who works for the Lutheran World Federation in the ecumenical office. So he spends a great deal of his time these days trying to keep, shall we say, the strong diplomatic relationships among Christians alive and well. But his area of work is liturgy. His doctorate from Candler was in liturgical studies, very interesting work on the relationship between the Lord's Supper and trauma. Then there is the Reverend Beth Horsch. Beth is the senior pastor at Mount Olivet Lutheran Church in Plymouth, Minnesota. Very experienced pastor. We also happen to share a love of Montana. And Beth knows how to ask really tough questions that then I spend big chunks of the rest of my life having to wrestle with, and I'm sure she'll be doing that today. Then Shawna Sanger-Gaines, the Reverend, a very fine theologian, senior pastor at Rebecca congregation in Nashville, Tennessee. It's of the Nazarene tradition, and a very experienced leader, having led both congregations in California as well as in Nashville. And next to her is the Reverend Rachel Stout. She is an ELCA pastor, a redeveloper. I think there's probably no harder job than getting a congregation to choose to reach out and be a part of its community. And Rachel has many years of experience with that, very effective leader, and one of our consultants at Church Innovations. And the person who's guiding us through this entire journey is the Reverend Dr. Nathan Pickard, who is also with us at Church Innovations, pastor of a congregation in Toronto, Canada, and the person who we will ask to guide us through the rest of this webinar.
So I want to set the stage for our conversation over the next 50 to 55 minutes. When COVID shut down our societies across North America, we felt the reverberations across the spectrums of our lives. Sports teams were canceled, family dinners were postponed, restaurants were closed, schools moved to virtual classrooms, weddings were postponed, put on hold. And then there is Christian worship. For some Christian faith communities, there was a mad rush, and the purchase of high-tech video equipment what took place, and we moved our worship to a virtual platform. and we invited people to watch, much like we would watch a television show. For other churches, they closed their doors as they didn't have the means or the knowledge and maybe the skills or desire to navigate a virtual platform. And then there were other churches that basically said, to hell with the government, and they opened their church doors and continued worship as if there was no pandemic. For myself, as one who thinks deeply about Christian community, thinks deeply about Christian worship and the church's life in the mission of God, I had a deep sense of dread. I instinctively believed this disruption would be long lasting, and I was fearful. But I also suspected that this disruption could be the place in which a new future could emerge in the life of God. So I moved from a spirit of dread to a spirit of hope, and I lived in between these two opposites. And I, along with others, we started wondering as we watched churches make decisions about worship, we started wondering what kinds of churches are being formed with the decisions we make concerning worship. My hunch is, a year into the pandemic, this question is gaining in importance with the interest of this webinar. So we thank you to each of our viewers who are participating by watching this. We're going to invite you into the question and answers so that if you have questions, you can write them in the Q&A, and we will do our best to bring those questions up in the midst of our conversations together. We got 4 building blocks that we want to use today in our conversation. The first building block is, what decisions have we seen congregations make? In the midst of this building block, we want to explore what questions were people asking a year ago. Building block number 2 is some reflection. What have we learned? Building block number 3 is, how are churches being formed with the decisions we've made? And included in this is the exploration, what questions are churches asking now? And then the final building block is, what kinds of questions do we think churches should ask in a post-COVID world? The stage is set now, so I want to bring in Rachel and the other panelists into the conversation. Rachel, what have you seen? What kind of decisions have you seen churches make? And what questions do you think people were asking a year ago?
So there were a variety of decisions that were made across the board. A lot of it depended upon resources, skill level. I know for myself, the learning curve was steep in terms of learning new technology, learning new ways of being communal. And so there was the shift, as we've said, to virtual worship, either pre-recorded, live streamed. Folks use Zoom and Facebook and that sort of thing. And the other thing that happened was there was a shift in the language about around church. Church wasn't just a place anymore. The emphasis was placed on the church as a people, that we could in fact be church outside of and away from our buildings and our sanctuaries. One of the questions that came up quite a bit, actually, and there was a lot of sort of logistical, pragmatic questions about how to do certain things. But one of them was, what about Holy Communion? And how do we tend to that, especially for those in a sacramental tradition? how do we tend to that? And the practices varied. I'll give you a couple examples that just kind of came up in my local context. So there is a small Missouri Synod parish just not far down the road. And in where I'm at, the rules were such that you could have gatherings no bigger than 10. So this pastor did 10 communion services each week with 10 people in them, counting himself. And that's what he did for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. But because people insisted on being in person, and that was the way communion could happen. Another example is there's a congregation in the other direction that encouraged their parishioners to gather in small groups and have communion in those small groups. And there wasn't really much in the way of resources sort of given other than just the permission to do it. A lot of the decisions around how worship were done were fueled by anxiety and anxiety around finances. Will people give if they don't come to church? And I think in some places that anxiety is still very real.
Yeah, Rachel, I love that you hit on what drove us to ask the questions, right? That it's not even just about what questions are we asking, but what's driving us to ask those questions. And so if it's anxiety over finance, that says something about the nature of the church, right? That we are an entity that must be funded to survive, which I'm sure pastors that are logging in are like, of course, that's what pays our salaries. But I think it does say something. The things that make us anxious say something about what we hold most deeply. I think that that's what some of those early questions really revealed. Saw a lot of anxiety around finances, and a lot of questions about how do I deliver the content of my sermon, right? That for churches in my tradition that are less liturgical, our church does receive Eucharist every week, but most churches in Church of Nazarene, I would say, probably do not. And so that wasn't the primary question people were asking. It was mainly, how do I deliver a sermon to people? How do I get that content out there? And so in our church, we had a wise pastor on our staff. His name's Jeremy Height, who pretty early on said, I think we need to really value connection over content right now. And that was a phrase that really stuck with us for a long time, that we still are trying to remind ourselves of in a very content heavy online world where it seems like everybody's developing content. It feels like you have to develop the best content. What are we putting the content before the connection with these group of disciples in Jesus that we believe are filled with the Spirit?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder too, with going back to sort of that content over connection, if there wasn't, the question of how do we do that? How do you stay connected when you can't leave your house? And yes, okay, there's the telephone and there's other sorts of means, but I think depending on one's context, how do you stay connected with people? And then it takes that much more energy in a situation of pandemic to make those connections. Everything takes a lot more energy, I should say. But that particularly, but yeah, I like that, the valuing connection over content.
And it also ask, what is genuine connection? Were we really connecting all that well when we just happened to attend the same Sunday school class and share a box of donuts and a cup of coffee? Like, was that real connection? And sometimes we found that people were opening up and connecting more deeply over a Zoom Bible study than they ever had when they just happened to be two bodies in the same room. Now, that's not always the case. I know that there's huge limitations to online connection, but it did kind of also drive the question, what do we mean when we say connection? What is a genuine connection?
Go ahead, Beth.
It also broke open. I think everyone was waited with bated breath, like how is staff going to perform and show up for this? And what happened is people realized I can't be a spectator in this community. I've got to participate. If you're waiting for the staff, you're going to get a music stand and an iPad with duct tape the first Sunday. It's like, how do we show up on this together? And I personally had to set myself free from this is not all about me, and also say, where is God in the midst? And if you're ever going to experiment, we had the opportunity to experiment, and that was the only way forward to do it. And talk about a lesson to be learned from everyone. And my other thought on that was, it was like, oh no, where is everybody? And you were forgetting who was showing up, that you might not be able to see a name on Facebook Live, someone is watching it later, and just trust how this community was forming. So you could ask a lot of questions, but you also had to show up each and every week and work the plan the work, but you had to work the plan and adjust. Every single day there was an adjustment to that.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I think it did, at least for me and the congregation I serve, is it forced us to make decisions that were down the road a bit for us, that we knew we were going to have to make. We had to make them right away, particularly in with regard to how, if we were going to offer a live streaming option, what would that, what does that look like? What are the resources? And what do we need to do that? And that was a question that was still a couple of years away for us. But we had to ask it now. And, there was nothing wrong with that it forced some of those questions for us.
Well, excuse me, we're ready to move on to the second block. If I can find my voice. And I'm going to invite Shawna in first, but this kind of disruptive moment brings a lot of new experiences, and it's tempting to build all of our desire around the move back to normalcy and fail to learn from this unique moment that we're in. And a big part of Church Innovations work is helping churches learn how to reflect on their experience. So Shawna, what did you learn?
So much, and that's great to remind us that we need time to actually slow down and reflect for it to have been a meaningful learning opportunity. But one of the things that I keep coming back to that we learned early on and are still struggling with is the nature between simplicity and complexity. Our church really discovered when everything shut down, even though we weren't using the language of our church is closed or shut down. We talked about other ways of thinking about the church, that it wasn't just about the building, but it really slowed the activity that we were about. And we realized just what a complex organization we had been. And for us, when we decided to move our online worship the way we did, I see that Nigel Rooms made a really interesting comment in here talking about churches struggling to figure out if they were going to do a pre-recorded service or some kind of live interactive service over Zoom. That was a hard choice for a lot of churches to make. For us, we chose to do a pre-recorded service that had like a live component at the beginning of it. And part of that for us was the simplicity that it brought to worship. We discovered that over the months where pretty much everything, in Nashville was shut down, and it was still sort of that we're all in this together moment. Yeah, remember those days? When there was that sort of forced simplicity with this one online kind of pre-recorded service and then other Zoom rooms and places where you could interact, that it actually opened up some wonderful missional activity in our church. that we would not have seen probably without the opportunity to slow down and realize how complex we had become, and that the complexity of our church was actually inhibiting missional activity. So over the summer months, we discovered folks in our congregation started up this incredible we have a retirement center on the same campus as our church and the university. And they started calling every single resident of the towers to say, do you have anybody to get groceries for you? Do you need somebody to go pick up your prescription medications? And they organized this incredible effort to make sure that every single resident in that, it's a low income retirement community, make sure that every single resident had access to groceries and medications and the things that they needed. We were invited as a congregation to participate in conversations around race and policing in the city of Nashville by the school that's right across the street from our church, and then another church next door. And we found ourselves suddenly, participating in conversations in the months of June and July as the nation was taking a really close look at the relationship between race and policing. And we got to participate in those conversations. There are other examples I'll save for time. Then when our church decided to move back into the building and kind of go to a hybrid model where we would have some folks gather and some folks join online, we decided we really wanted to still try to maintain simplicity for the sake of our missional activity. So we said that in board meeting and staff meeting, that simplicity is important. And so for us, that meant not going back to what we had done before, which was two very different worship services, one that was more traditional, one that was more contemporary. We decided we're only going back with one worship service, but in this online on-campus hybrid. What we found is that the nature of meeting together with human beings during a pandemic is necessarily complex, that there just was not a simple way to do it. And so we saw a lot of the missional activity that had been really active during the summer month kind of started to dwindle away. And so we're still wrestling with that, with how we find that place of simplicity that allows mission to thrive in a church culture that sometimes thrives off of complexity, loving, seeming like a really complex church with lots of programs and things like that always going on. So that's something that we're still trying to find that we've learned, I think, from this last year.
Good. Someone else, what have you learned? Dirk, we haven't heard from you yet. Is there a learning that you could share?
You're on mute.
Have a slightly different experience, perhaps from Shawna, where we have gone with the in-person or the live Zoom experience of worship rather than pre-recorded. And of course, what we learned is the immense effort that is required of people. I think you spoke, Shawna, about the simplicity that the pre-recorded gave you. I can certainly affirm that, because the live worship via Zoom is very, very intense. At the same time, it gave a way of people actually interacting with the worship in ways which they would perhaps not normally do in a Sunday service, where they would just sit very obediently in their pew. Here, people were able to chime in and occasionally even interrupt. And it brought a certain freedom also for those who were participating, which I found really quite intriguing. And someone, I don't know now who, mentioned in the chat also the possibility then of coffee hour or fellowship hour after church, which then the worship flowed immediately into a time of sharing after the worship in that online format, or live format, I mean.
Could I jump in and say, I learned that a new way of worship invited voices that we had either intentionally or unintentionally suppressed over the years to have a voice. And for us, that was very helpful. In the chat, there is this question, and I think we should explore it together. A handful of folks in my small faith community and a number of friends in other cities have opted not to return to church gatherings as they prefer the new rhythm they have found. What, if anything, might the church have to learn from these folks? Anyone want to answer that question?
We need to listen. What I have found, and people have specifically said, I'm an introvert. I don't like big public gatherings. I don't like them anymore with COVID. I find that doing spiritual practice, whether it's dwelling in the word or a centering prayer experience within a community, granted it's not the full worship experience, is grounding me in trusted space. We need to listen to people. How has this been going? Where is the spirit? What's bringing you life? What has already formed because of this? And stop being so busy doing everything well, and stop and reflect and notice what has happened over this last year and give ourselves permission to do that.
Yeah, I'm part of a smaller worshiping community. And one thing we've noticed is that we have people from all over the United States now who worship with us every week. And we don't know what will happen to that. It's been very meaningful, not only for us, but for them. And once we go back to in person, we don't know whether we'll do a hybrid thing to continue to allow that experience. But we've also noticed that because of the destaging, if you will, of our worship, that there's more opportunity for personal care to be communicated each and every week. And we're going to have to figure out how that's going to continue to be part of who we are and what we do going forward.
I would like to just respond to what Beth was saying, which I found really intriguing, to give ourselves the time to be listening and giving ourselves the time and thinking of the different ways people engage in worship. So often, at least in my experience, and I speak now not as a regular presiding pastor in a congregation, but as a professor of liturgy. So my experience is a bit different than perhaps some of yours. But when I see what happens just from going around, I see worship that is so tightly scripted that doesn't give space for other forms of necessary expression. And I think of some traditions, particularly our Catholic sisters and brothers who have, or Orthodox as well, who give space within their buildings even for people to just move out of a particular liturgy and engage in prayer or some silent time. Where does that fit into some of our scripted liturgies that allows introverts as well as extroverts to engage, and everyone in between?
Well, it's time to move on to our third building block, which is to do another level of reflection. I have to say that we had something very interesting happen in our family for the first time in over 30 years. All three daughters, all our grandchildren were participating in the same worship service on Sundays. In a very small congregation in the high mountains outside of Yellowstone National Park, but by way of Zoom, and very interactive. And then we would have a conversation after service in our family book club. Never hadn't happened in over 30 years. All because, and believe me, for Jeanette and myself, wow, that was a big deal. So the questions that start me wrestling now is looking at the development of our society, our culture over the last 200, 250 years, and how worship plays into that. And one of the things I've learned by studying that with care, as well as studying literally thousands of congregations around the world, is these decisions we're making are profoundly shaping community, not just the community of the church, which surely it is, but also what counts as community in other settings. And community, whether we like it or not, is being formed. And so I want to move to a step further removed and ask Dirk to lead us in this conversation. Given all these decisions we've had to make, what have those decisions actually done in the forming of a Christian sense of, or more importantly, the Christian practices of corporate community?
Yeah, thank you, Pat. I think just as you mentioned, it's important always to remember that, of course, every action we engage in, every decision we make or do not make, shapes, forms us as individuals and as communities. Formation is always happening in some way or another. So how has the church been formed by decisions made over the past year? Even though we are a year into the pandemic and we're really not seeing an end of it yet, I have more questions really than answers. But as Nathan also said at the beginning of this webinar, this question around of how we are being formed is urgent and important. Though I believe it's still too early to understand how church has been shaped, here are a few of the concerns I see that as I look ahead, as I reflect on the past practices I've seen and engaged. So I'm not wanting to make these universal. These are coming out of my own experience, and again, as a parishioner rather than as someone who is regularly planning or presiding at worship. I've talked with many former students who are now serving pastors about these concerns, and here are four comments, but I will pose them more as questions because, again, because I'm not 100% sure what shape or how these may be impacting, but they're questions, I guess, for reflection. First of all, has the decision to provide as complete a worship experience as possible online meant that we have turned worship into a consumer product and thereby formed communities as consumers rather than as disciples who are open, even vulnerable to be led and shaped by the Holy Spirit. Another way of asking this, has worship now become something people fit into the rhythm of their busy schedules, like just another activity or like a pre-recorded TV sitcom, rather than as something around which life is shaped? Secondly, this question applies particularly to the sacraments for those in a sacramental tradition. Has the decision to continue to offer Holy Communion because the faithful expect or desire it shaped the relationship of the faithful to this gift? Have the faithful now become even more accustomed into believing that the sacrament is something personal, individual, a Jesus and me moment, or perhaps something that can easily be celebrated within a small, close family or friend group? Has the decision to offer virtual communion diminished the call found within the sacrament, namely to be a place of radical welcome for the stranger, a community that bears sufferings of one another, and especially the sufferings of the neighbor? Thirdly, has the decision to overcome the restrictions to gather in person imposed by COVID meant that we have missed an opportunity to form faith communities as communities of vigilant waiting, a community of listening? Have we seized this pedagogical opportunity and spiritual opportunity? And finally, though we've already discussed this at some length already, has the decision even to go online, not that we had much choice in that, has created these bifurcated communities, or has it helped a community, and I'm thinking of Rachel's comment earlier on, has it helped a community define a new identity as church in the neighborhood rather than associated with a particular building? So what signs of hope does that offer us? Just some of my own questions around how these decisions are forming us or forming our communities.
You know, and with that, Dirk, I saw another great, I just hear in all those questions how we have been formed by having to ask more questions in this season. And hopefully that'll be a fruitful outcome of all this, of just having to ask more questions. I see in the chat this shift between the relationship between public and private, and I do find that fascinating. I think it was Nigel again who posed that, and that's certainly something to ponder when we think about the public and private nature of worship. He noted that it used to be our public worship took place in rather private spaces, but now we're worshiping in homes, and yet it's publicly being broadcast on the internet. And how in this season, I think public and private, those lines have been blurred for so many of us. We have, like right now, my kids just started back to in-person worship, or they might be running through the background right now. You would, I mean, you're seeing homes and offices. Like we didn't used to get to see this kind of part of people's lives. People are seeing the lives of their coworkers in a new way, coworkers who have to care for vulnerable family members right now, who have small children at home. I mean, our personal, private, public lives in this last year have all been very intermingled, and that certainly has an impact on our worship life. And I don't have an answer to that question, but I am fascinated by what this will mean in terms of our sense of identity, self, and even just our public presence of worship in the future.
Yeah, you know, I've been thinking about, what are these, we had to make so many quick decisions around worship, particularly around worship and how we deliver worship. And it gets back to what we were talking a bit about earlier. Have we thought then about the consequences of that, or have we thought about what other opportunities might be out there that we haven't taken seriously yet? For example, the whole question of listening closely to the needs of one another. Or what about the spiritual practice, deep spiritual practice of waiting in a society that doesn't like to wait, that wants everything right away? Are there also pedagogical opportunities that we could use now to teach our congregations about what does worship actually mean? Where is it rooted? How is it part of the life? Why do we even do it? Do we have those take this time to raise those questions too?
And does the church have the guts to say we don't have this figured out? I mean, and how can we model being learners and leaders at the same time?
Yeah. Right, we're all on this spiritual journey together of searching, right?
Yeah.
Okay, with our time, oh, go ahead, Mark.
Nope. Go ahead, Nathan. Move us.
I was going to say, with our time, we need to kind of shift to what kinds of questions do we want to be asking? And Dirk has already laid out, I think, several questions we need to ask. There's a lot of questions in the chat, like, what's the definition now of a full worship experience?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe what's the scorecard that we're going to use now, right? Because the scorecard used to be, was the singing good? Was the preaching good, right? Well, there is no singing on Zoom, right? Or God help us if there is, right? So what's the scorecard? How do we reach out to those who have just walked away? You know, for those who have become disengaged, how do we reach back out? What other questions, maybe Beth, are you going to want to ask your faith community and others?
So I want to start with this, and then I just made a list of 10 questions, not exclusive, comprehensive, and then I just want to tell 2 stories. Number 1, these decisions are deeply contextual. You need to know who you are as a community before you decide. At Mount Olivet, we knew we could not have a pre-recorded worship service because our prayers of the people are the prayers of the people. And even to write a prayer in Facebook Live and have someone else see it and respond to it was forming community. So if you haven't done that already, know who you are, and then don't compare yourself to anybody else. You are who you are. You need to make decisions. Look up from the technical details to the adaptive change happening. And what is the view from the other side of the camera? I realized one Sunday that I was looking into a screen that was 2 inches by 2 inches. I had no idea what was on the other side. Reach out to people, send me a picture of how you are worshiping. Let me see your altar in your home. Where is the Holy Spirit in all of this? Stop working it and discern that and wrestle with it. What is the unexpected and the imperfect in this? How do we, as you said, Dirk, create room for the segue to name the moment? What are those communities that are already forming? We talked about that. How in the world are we going to sustain this? Where are the limits? Pat, to use your word, where's the strategic abandonment in all of this? What has already died? And then how is that death creating the soil for what is meant to grow? How can acts of worship open up the confessions of the heart? What in the world does church membership mean anymore? And where are the other worship spaces that we're called to attend to? So 2 stories. We are live every Sunday, and it is a complete comedy to see me try to remove my face mask with an earring, over the ear mic, and eyeglasses, okay? And I finally got to the point where it's gonna be a mess every week, but people have said, Beth, then I know that you're real. Then I know that you're live. And so the mishaps in worship, the awkward pause, the dropping of something has made people come to expect, like, okay, this is real life. My life is imperfect too. That was an aha moment for me. And I stopped trying to be the actor and just be the human. The second story is my colleague Joel and I did imposition of ashes on Ash Wednesday, and people drove up in the car. I thought, of course, they're coming because they want the ashes with the olive oil on their head. The minute the car window rolled down, it was the gush of the heartache. They didn't care about the ash. It was like, I need to tell you what's going on in my life. And they saw the car behind them, so they knew they didn't have 20 minutes. And I'm thinking, what is care to community? People need the invitation to come in and be real and raw. We couldn't fix it, but we were there to receive what they needed to expel, what they needed to speak into this world, this truth that's happening. So those are a few stories, lots of questions. I'd be interested in what you all are thinking too, because my God, we need each other in all this. We cannot do this on our own.
You know, Beth, along those lines, one of the things that kind of keeps coming up for me is about hospitality, and how do we host people in, and how are we hosted by people in a virtual space?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have any answers. I just have that question. And I just, so yeah, so that's my wondering, is how are we hosting, but also being hosted at the same time. And I love your story about the face mask and the glasses and the earrings, because I have the same, the same problem too. And yeah, it is kind of a comedy of errors, and it's good. One funny story. So my mother lives 5 hours away from where I am. And because we're live, she can watch us. Well, she can watch worship and be in worship. And otherwise she's only ever in worships with me at my churches when she's visiting. And she texted me, and she's a novice to texting. But she said, "Oh, it's so good to see you alive." Mm-hmm. And what she meant, of course, is it's so good to see you live. Mm-hmm. But she said, it's so good to see you alive. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I knew what she meant, but behind it, I'm like, yeah, you're also kind of, you are glad that, I mean, it is good to see, to see a daughter that's 5 hours away alive. Yeah, it is. But
Rachel, I love that you brought up the difference between hosting and being hosted, and how in this season we had to trust Facebook to host our worship services, right? Like for many of us, this is why we pour so much time and energy to make sure that we have buildings so that we can always host worship. And we've been depending on Zoom or Facebook Live or whatever to be the hosts, and thinking about being hosted in different ways. And isn't part of the reason Jesus sends the disciples out to be hosted in the homes of strangers is because this seems to produce a rather gospel-like posture in our lives, right? To be received, to depend on others. I hope that this shapes leaders in a very deep way. I love what Beth said earlier about leading and learning at the same time. Somebody had put something in the chat too about being the chief question askers or the chief question framers or something like that. Early on in the pandemic, I felt like everybody was looking for who had the answers to this. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't believe how fast N.T. Wright put out a book, like that was amazing. And there's good stuff in there. I'm not bagging on N.T. Wright, but everybody was looking for somebody like an N.T. Wright to have the answers to this, somebody that we can trust and who will know where to go. And it just takes me back to what I feel like Beth has been bringing us back to over and over. Have we lost the capacity to listen to the Spirit and trust that each local congregation in its context is being led? It's somewhere into someone's lives. And so I hope for us, for our congregation, there will be that sense of posture of humility, to trust that the Spirit is leading us and that we need to take on new postures to be able to be received in the lives of others in this post-pandemic world.
And Scott, your comment at the end, there's not a lot of liturgy when you're discerning who you are, but there's a ton of community. And what does that say? That it has broken open this gathering of community, this forming of Christian community outside necessarily the expected frameworks of worship, and the accessibility now of worship for a person who would never walk into the church, probably because they've been hurt by it, now can access that in a new way. And to be able to speak that comment and know that that is possible now, where probably wasn't possible before. But I applaud you for knowing who you are, and you realize how different that is from other churches.
Picking up on that too gets back to what you were saying, Beth, about knowing your community, the identity of your community. And that is also linked, I think, to this comment by Scott. Knowing what liturgy is, what is worship for this community, and taking the time to actually understand what is the role of worship. We just assumed we do this week after week, Sunday after Sunday, according to a set pattern. But what is each of our theology of worship, and how does the congregation engage that? Do they understand why they come, why they do this together as an activity more than just meeting one another?
Well, this has been a very stimulating conversation. We want to thank our panelists, Beth and Rachel and Shawna and Dirk, for paying attention to what's been happening and to sharing so eloquently, I think, with us today. We thought a lot about what the aim of an hour should be or could be. And I think Beth's comment about contextuality meant that we couldn't provide answers and we shouldn't pretend to, but that the important thing was to be able to initiate a moment of reflection around asking the right questions. And I think we've done that. And not only our panelists, but those people who've commented online have helped us to do that as well. Here's some things, some big things that I've heard in the last hour. We have found life. I mean, we just have. And it's been surprising in many ways, things that we would have never anticipated, but we have found life. And the Spirit of God is the Spirit of life. And so I think it's not only an opportunity to celebrate the Spirit's movement among us, but also to ask, where are we going? Where is the Spirit leading? And not to rush too quickly to kind of technical solutions, or not to rush too quickly to having the next thing figured out, but to be comfortable with the notion that our leading right now is through listening and through discerning the moment that we're in. It's occurred to me, along with Beth's comment that context matters, that size also matters. And I'm wondering if a question we should ask is, have we been forming certain kinds of communities around the sizes of our congregations? Dirk's comments about are we creating more consumers and kind of this voyeuristic online kind of thing, I think is a question we should have already been asking, right? Before we went online, that we're doing worship and have been for a long time in ways that have created consumers. So now have we found some things, some patterns of care, to go back to Shawna's observation, the move from complexity to simplicity, the Scott's observation in the comments that we're moving from maybe less liturgy, but more community and care. I wonder if those are directions that we should pay attention to. I'm a big believer in embodiment, that our lives are communal and embodied. And I'm wondering if there's such a thing as virtual embodiment. Because I know that I have found more immediate care in Zoom worship than I have in sitting in a pew for an hour on Sunday. But I also resonate with Beth's comment about the imposition of ashes and the desire and need to touch someone's arm and to share a hug. And I'm longing now for that. And that points again, I think, to the importance of kind of person-to-person worship. And so we have all these kind of confusing ingredients now to make a new stew. And we hope that today has provided an opportunity for you to think about the seasoning and mixing of elements in a way that will allow you to pursue the leading of the living God. Pat?
Well, just two quick things. We have at least two more of these webinars that are looking at what's the COVID reality doing in our local churches. The one is on preaching and the other is on other spiritual practices. And I would say, to oversimplify, but to follow up on Beth Horsch's sets of questions, remember every speech act, and liturgy is speech act, as well as preaching, reveals three things, three characters, and this is about character. The character of the speaker, the character of the audience, and the character of the speech itself. This is a time in which the church's character is being, whether we like it or not, revealed. And as Leslie Newbigin, Bishop Newbigin, reminded us over and over again, the local church is the hermeneutic of the gospel for the people in that community. So this is a missional moment like we've never had in my lifetime. And as we move to our next seminars, we'll be exploring that. But we're out of time now. And I'll turn it over to Nathan, because we have one more thing we're going to beg you to do for us.
We want to end with a blessing on everyone, but we also would like you to take 10 seconds and just answer this one question. And it popped up on your screen. If you could answer that in the next 10, 15 seconds, and then we'll end with a blessing upon everyone. Again, we sincerely appreciate the conversation. And to our panelists, you have made me want to go back and listen again to this webinar as you've helped me think more critically and deeply. So thank you. We'll end with a blessing. May the God who raised Jesus from the dead and brought back our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ bless you and equip you with all the knowledge and power to lead and form your churches and your families deeper into the image of God. And may the Spirit of God be at work in all of our faith communities and in this world, making all things new. May we go with the peace of God. Amen.
Um,
Thank you, friends.
Thank you.